Well, here we are again. It's Wednesday evening and we're not able to gather as a family for our classes, so I wanted to share with you something this evening that might be a blessing to you. I'm getting ready to do a leadership retreat this weekend, and I've been looking a lot at the life of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah reminds me of a lot of you, because as Christians, you are leaders. You're leaders in your home, you're leaders in the public, you're leaders at your job. You do various things throughout your life and throughout the community where people look to you for advice and they look to you for help. Nehemiah was a tremendous leader and a tremendous builder. And I want to begin with a question tonight just to get you to thinking. It's something that has to do with Nehemiah and his life and what we find in Nehemiah chapter 5. So I'd like for you to turn there with me, Nehemiah chapter 5. And let me ask you the question, which is harder to deal with, success or adversity? Now, I want us to kind of ponder that for a second. We all know that adversity is a harsh teacher, but I think there's a test that can be more challenging than adversity: advancement or success. Now, I know that doesn't sound right. I know that goes against all of our cultural norms, but I really think it's true. Thomas Carlyle, who was a Scottish historian, said one time, "Adversity is sometimes hard upon a man, but for one man who can stand prosperity, there are 100 that will stand adversity." Few people can live in luxury and maintain their spiritual equilibrium or their moral or emotional equilibrium either. And I think that may be one of the reasons why Jesus said it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. We all know that self-sufficiency and pride both go before a fall. So to me, it's ironic that more of us can survive a demotion with our integrity intact better than we can a promotion. A good example of that might be Asaph. Now, we don't talk about him a lot, and we really don't know a lot about him, except that he wrote 12 of the Psalms. Psalm 75 is one of those Psalms, and it convinces me that he had something good going on in his mind. Sandwiched between the first and the last sections of that psalm, in verse 5 through 7, we read, "Do not lift your horns against heaven. Do not speak so defiantly. No one from the east or the west or from the desert can exalt themselves. It is God who judges. He brings one down. He exalts another." If I could paraphrase that for you, he's saying, don't toot your own horn. Remember, your promotion just didn't evolve. Behind your recent exaltation was the sovereign hand of God. You are the recipient of goodness and grace. Now, that's really easy to forget. And our culture really doesn't see it that way either. But God is the one who suddenly lifted Joseph from an Egyptian dungeon to the role of prime minister. And think about Daniel. Overnight almost, he exalted Daniel from a Babylonian boot camp to the king's right hand. God knew that those guys could handle a promotion, and so could Nehemiah. Let's talk about him for a moment. Nehemiah was a guy who could handle situations that were bad, but he also stood firm whenever things were good. He was a competent leader, and as a result, he was promoted. I want to read from Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 14. Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 14 says, "Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year," that's 12 years, "neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor." Now I want you to notice Nehemiah accepted that appointment. And this may be a side note, but I think that our prayer should be that God will raise up more Christians in strategic spots like business leaders, filmmakers, college professors, and Politicians. People who can fashion and frame the minds of the public. People who will be in those situations and be salt and be light. There are already some Christians, I think, in those roles, but I don't know that there are nearly enough. Nehemiah accepted this governorship, and immediately he faced three major concerns that would confront anyone who receives a promotion. And they're all found in that one little paragraph from verses 14 through 18. And the first one is this: promotion brings privilege. Increased responsibility usually gives the recipient new or added rights, more benefits, special favors, and the list could go on and on. But the wise leader will use them without abusing them. Now, we read that a moment ago in verse 14. As a governor, he could have entertained all of the other officials with a food allowance that he was given. We might liken it today to an expense account. And we know what people do with their expense accounts. There's a lot of abuse that takes place. But Nehemiah didn't take any liberties with this allowance so that he could regain his integrity. You say, well, how does that apply to me? The private life of a leader, of a builder, is under the constant attack of the devil. Now, you know that Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And as a leader doing that great job, moral compromise could have been an easy trap to fall into. But he wouldn't do it. We've all heard the definition of character, that character is what you look like in the dark or what you are when nobody's watching. There's another thing that I want to bring up here. I think it's significant that Nehemiah never tried to turn the power of his position into an opportunity to gain personal power. He could have become the wealthiest man in Jerusalem by purchasing land, by investing in businesses, by even demanding protection money from those nobles. And Nehemiah viewed that appointment to governor as a trusted position, and he closely guarded the confidence of his leaders. Let me give you an opposite idea or an opposite example. I was reading the other day about Absalom. Absalom illustrates how not to handle a promotion. You remember Absalom was the handsome son of King David. And on the outside, he exuded warmth and charisma. But on the inside, he was a rebel. And in looking at his life, I think David struggled to train him properly. David was pretty much an uninvolved father during those years. And because of that, it had tragic results. It may have been due to guilt over his negligence, but David promoted Absalom onto the court. Big mistake. Absalom set up his own court outside the palace, and he ruled on a lot of cases. And he even reminded people that they got justice from him that they would not have gotten from his father. And so eventually he got enough political clout and military power to overthrow the government and drive his own father off the throne. People with increased responsibilities have to face the temptations that come with that privilege. Second thing, success doesn't ensure ease. You have to stay the course. Nehemiah is rebuilding this wall of Jerusalem, and he has this challenge as he started. His administration replaced a corrupt government. The people were used to dirty politics. They were used to overtaxation and extortion and favoritism and things like that. But in verse 15, at least the first part of that verse, this is what we read. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Now, it would have been likely that Nehemiah's advisors would have expected him to carry on the same practices as his predecessor. But Nehemiah wouldn't do that. Nehemiah, if you look at the last part of verse 15, it says, their assistants also lorded it over the people. Look at this. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. I love that. In other words, it's like he's saying, I have a job to do. The God of heaven promoted me to do it, and I answer to Him. He will protect me, so I have no need to continue the corruption. Now, in spite of that pressure to fold, Nehemiah stood firm. He knew that he had a choice. He could bear the pressure alone and let it come between himself and God, or he could allow the Lord to bear the load. And so by answering only to God, the stress became the catalyst that fused his heart to the Lord's, and it just sealed his integrity. Verse 16, I want you to notice what the text says. He said, instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. What a rare man. That is genuine leadership. Nehemiah didn't become governor so he could engage in his own pet projects. He stayed on the task of building that wall. He didn't abuse the promotion. He didn't turn it into a lucrative opportunity for himself. He never lost sight of his goal. In fact, if you go on and read in verse 17, furthermore, 150 Jews, officials, ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from each of the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were already heavy on these people. I want you to see the kitchen never closed. He had to feed thousands of people every month. That's a lot of groceries. He was a well-known, highly sought-after political figure, a very public man, but he never lost sight of the project. Someone put it this way in a book that I was reading the other day: his belly didn't block his vision. Again, let's talk about another opposite example. You think of Solomon. Solomon couldn't keep up whenever he became the richest man in the world. In fact, from one importing enterprise alone, from one importing enterprise alone, according to 1 Kings chapter 10, Solomon made the equivalent of close to $1 billion annually. It's just on one enterprise. He owned handcrafted shields containing enough gold to be worth $64 million. Scripture tells us that under Solomon's leadership, the silver in Jerusalem became as common as stones. But Solomon couldn't handle the pressure of responsibility. Have you ever read the Book of Ecclesiastes? You read that and you think, how in the world could this be in the Bible? What Ecclesiastes is it's the diary of a man who quit looking above the sun for his help and for his guidance and for his wisdom, and he just kept his vision below the sun at what all he was doing. Over the long haul, the fiber of his life began to come apart under the stress of temptation. So let me just quickly close with a few observations. Lastly, your success affects the lives of others. Being a leader, being a builder, being a Christian is a people-oriented job. And you have no leader, you're not leading if people aren't following. Again, verse 18, he said, each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Frequently, a strong leader will become so focused on the objective that he or she runs roughshod over the people who work to achieve it. And Nehemiah never neglected his project, but he also kept the needs of the people in focus. Nehemiah led with compassion. In fact, the text tells us that whenever he saw that the people were overburdened and overtaxed, he backed off and he said, let's progress at a reasonable pace. Let's keep in step with each other and let's just face one problem at a time. Nehemiah never lost his sensitive spirit. Nehemiah's heart is beautifully seen, particularly in two phrases that I think demonstrate how he was able to endure the temptations of increased privileges, maintaining his focus on the project and caring for the needs of the people. And the first phrase was something he said in verse 15. Look at it again. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. That tells us that Nehemiah nurtured a relationship with the Lord that stood stronger than any of those external forces. In spite of his salary, the privileges, or the pressure, he said, in effect, my accountability to the Lord is the focus of my life, and I fear Him too much to indulge myself. Now, that doesn't mean that people in a relationship with the Lord can't have nice things. If it did, we'd all be in trouble. We just don't allow those nice things to have us. Let's hold everything loosely so that God can remove from our grasp whatever He needs to take away from us. And then verse 19 has the second phrase that I think reveals Nehemiah's heart. It was when he said, remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. Now, you might read that at first and think, well, that sounds kind of bold and self-promoting, but I want you to know it's so much more. It's a prayer that invites God to hold him accountable for his actions and to treat him accordingly. I think it's probably similar to what David said in Psalm 139, verse 23, where he says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way of everlasting. I think he's just committing himself to a conduct that would be worthy of reward. Adversity is tough to endure, but surviving those perils of success, I think, is even tougher. Adversity forces us to trust, to wait on God, to turn to Him for strength. But that success, that advancement, can bring a host of difficulties. It can bring pride. It can bring temptation to abuse privileges. It can bring pressure from former policies and leaders. It can bring distraction from some basic objectives and an inclination to overlook the needs of people who are under our authority. I love reading the book of Nehemiah. As a builder and as a leader, he passed the test, and we admire him for it. It's important for us as Christians to handle our blessings with grace. I just wanted to give you that to think about this week, and I hope that you are handling your blessings with grace. Thanks so much for joining in and watching this study and thinking about these things. I love you all. Thanks for joining.